Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It is 6 o'clock, and as promised, we like to get started promptly. Thank you so much for joining us tonight via Zoom. It's hard to imagine that when we started this series in early March, Zoom was the only option. So I know people are starting to get out and about, but we're still really grateful for this format, which allows us to bring in speakers from across the South and the country. So my name is Leslie Scarden. I'm on the board of the League of Women Voters of the Charleston area. I was our Director of Good Government and Ethics, and starting July 1, I'll be our Director of Advocacy. We are excited to have you all. Just a few housekeeping items. You'll be automatically muted when you enter, but please keep yourself on mute. If you also want to turn off your video to focus on the panelists, that's great. We will have time for Q&A at the end, so please submit your questions via the chat feature to the host, and we'll do questions at the end, but please stay on mute. We are live streaming this on Facebook, and the recording will be available there when we're done. So this is our fifth and final session of our Good Governance series on election systems and voter representation. We have some wonderful speakers with us tonight who are going to speak on what continues to be a very timely topic. We do want to thank our collaborators from across the state and the country who have been a part of this series and really spreading the word. I'll run through these very quickly, but we have the League of Women Voters from South Carolina, and then other counties and cities across the state, the College of Charleston Political Science Department, Women in Leadership, the Berkeley Chamber of Commerce, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the ACLU of South Carolina Coalition for Minority Affairs, and South Carolina Interfaith Power and Light and Sustaining Way. So a really wonderful group of collaborators who have helped make this possible. Also want to thank many of our league members who have worked really hard to do this series, from Barbara Griffin to Barbara Zia, Shayna Howell, Sarah, Kirsten, Joan, Leah, and many others. So thank you all. So hopefully you all have been able to tune in to some of our other events. This series is a nonpartisan series that promotes education and awareness relating to critical good government issues that impact the national, state, and local levels. We've done this our fifth and final session. All the recordings for the others are accessed online via Facebook. Each event has pre-reads, so if you're interested, you can learn more. And then of course, we have a call to action to follow up on the great education that we will receive tonight and for our other sessions. This final session is incredibly applicable now and probably always, but even more so this evening as the Senate considers HR 1 S1 this week, and as New York City actually uses ranked choice voting in their mayoral primaries tomorrow. So very timely topics we're tackling this evening. Final session explores how election systems can enhance voter representation. We'll start by reviewing South Carolina's current election systems, and then we'll examine a number of topics through the lens of ranked choice voting. So everything from open primaries to at-large or single-member districts and citizen-led ballot initiatives. We have three amazing speakers with us. We have John Simpkins, Paula Lee, and Barbara Klein. John is going to kick us off this evening, so I will give a quick introduction and then turn it over to him, who will do a great job. So John is a constitutional law scholar and former presidential administration counsel who has played a leadership role in advancing an equity agenda for women and people of color in the South. He is the president of MDC, which is a Durham-based nonprofit, a spinoff from North Carolina Governor Terry Sanford's landmark anti-poverty program that equips Southern leaders, institutions, and communities to improve economic mobility. John is no stranger to South Carolina. He grew up in Lexington, and he was the associate director of the Riley Institute at Furman University, and was also the director of diversity initiatives at the Charleston School of Law, and has been a wonderful friend to the League. So I'm going to turn it over to John and stop screen sharing. Everyone please sit back and enjoy.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you to the organizers of this fifth session and all the members of the League for everything that you do to promote ballot access and make real this promise of democracy. And I want to begin with a quote from Winston Churchill, which many of you have heard. It's been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other forms that have been tried from time to time. So said Winston Churchill in 1947. And I want you to take note of that date, because it's going to be important as we take a quick stroll through some of the significant features in the election system and the electoral process in South Carolina. But before we do that, we're going to lift up a little bit to look at it at the national level, and then up a little bit higher to look at it at the international level. As Leslie mentioned, I'm a constitutional law scholar, professor, and as a result, I tend to think about these things in a constitutional context, in the framework of a constitution. So what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about some very elementary pieces of what will inform our discussion this evening. Specifically, what framing documents like constitutions do. What is their purpose? And we can identify two primary purposes for a constitution, two primary substantive purposes. One, they articulate a structure of government. They set out how governments are set up and organized, and how they engage with each other across those structures and different components of government. And two, they lay out the rights to be recognized and protected. Who's protected under those rights, and what are the responsibilities that accrue as a result of the expression of those rights? So if we look at constitutions in democracies all across the world, we see those basic features. And as we think about whether or not the US Constitution has informed or served as a model for other constitutions, it certainly has in laying out that basic framework. Now, as to the substance and the focus, I'd say that it's shifted over time, and constitutions like that of Canada, Germany's basic law, and the South African Constitution tend to be more influential in new constitutional governance structures. But I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that structure of government. And then we'll talk a little bit about the rights as they're articulated, certainly in an American context, and what that means when we talk about South Carolina. There are two primary structures of democratic governments, if we think of how democratic governments are organized. They're parliamentary systems and they're presidential systems. Under a parliamentary system, which happens to be actually the most prevalent system of democratic organization in the world, there's majority rule, but there's also significant minority representation. We're seeing it right now in a parliamentary system in Israel, where a coalition government has come together in which no one has an outright majority within the government, but these parties have come together to form a government as a way of expressing the political will of the people. And parliamentary systems can have a number of different ways of voting. They often incorporate some form of proportional representation. A common feature of parliamentary systems is something called list proportional representation, or list PR. And that's essentially voting for the party. And each party submits a list. That list contains the number of slots that are available in the legislature or the governing body. And the party fills those slots based on the proportion of the vote that they win. So if there are 100 seats, you win 30% of the vote, you get 30 seats in that body. That sets out fairly clearly who's in and who's out. There may be threshold percentages that parties have to reach in order to gain representation. But you can also imagine, if we think about that in the context of the United States, what that might look like in terms of representation of third parties, of splinter parties within major parties, and other forms of representation. What I'll also add is that typically what we see is that even in a proportional representation system, even in a parliamentary system, there typically emerge two primary parties with a number of other parties competing for additional seats. There are other ways in which you might organize voting in a parliamentary system, multi-member constituencies or districts. You can have these at-large seats in which the member doesn't represent a particular geographic area, but is sort of representing the entire region as well as geographically defined constituencies. I've been in Washington, D.C. for a while, and the city of Washington, D.C., as well as a number of other cities, often have this combination of at-large and districted seats that are set aside. And one less common feature that we often see in parliamentary systems as a form of proportional representation is to look at ensuring that there's sufficient representation among rural communities. So there's a rural-urban proportional voting split. We see that a little bit in the way that our system is set up in the United States with the House and the Senate as a way of giving greater voice to rural communities. Some people would say outsized voice to rural communities. But focusing on our system for a moment, our system is a presidential system. It's a system in which there is majority rule with limited minority representation. If one party wins the presidency, the other party doesn't get the vice presidency, although we had sort of experimented with that very early in our history in the United States. But the idea is now that the executive branch is controlled by one party, the party that wins the presidential election. There certainly is potential for divided government via the legislative branch, or to the extent that there is some politicization of the judicial branch. The way in which we select the winner in most of these races is what we call first past the post. The person who gets the most votes wins. We may require a threshold showing or a majority of the votes cast, but ultimately what we're looking for is the person who gets the most votes wins. That's it. Loser goes home, and that's the end of it. It's sort of consistent with the way that we think of sports. You've got your Super Bowl champion and then whoever lost, and we don't really think about the losers anymore. But the problem there is that it creates a difference in the balance of power and influence. There's a difference between the share of votes and the share of seats. This can create inflated majorities or false majorities or even false winners. And by false winners or false majorities, what I mean is essentially you could have a party or a candidate from a party who wins the most votes in a race in which there are 6 candidates, but none of those candidates may have gained a true majority of the vote. They may represent a plurality of the voters, but they don't represent a majority of the vote. And that's worth keeping in mind as we think about some alternatives like ranked choice voting. I also want to talk a little bit about the role of the federal government in elections. And I think it's important to understand, especially as we think about this in terms of the Constitution. Power shared, obviously, between national and state governing bodies in the United States and local governments as well. Elections are controlled primarily by states. States set the terms by which elections are conducted for the most part. This means there's limited federal authority to intervene in state electoral systems and processes, and it's typically only in egregious cases. There is no fully articulated fundamental right to vote of general applicability as a matter of law that's spelled out in the Constitution. Now, we do have the Reconstruction Amendments, the 14th and 15th Amendment. The 14th Amendment conferred citizenship on enslaved Black Americans. The 15th Amendment prohibited voting discrimination based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Those two amendments together passed in the aftermath of the Civil War, empowered formerly enslaved African Americans to express their political right to select candidates to represent them. We also had the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the 19th Amendment, which granted female suffrage. These all broaden access to the ballot. and they further democratize our process. And it's also worth thinking about this in the context of minorities and majorities. At the founding, we were essentially ruled by a minority. White men made up a minority of the population, and yet they largely, especially landowning white men, held the franchise, whereas no one else did. So even when we think about this in terms of democracies in which we seek to promote the will of majorities, from the very founding in the United States, that's been a fraught relationship. And I want to get into a little bit more of what I recognize as a core tension in the way that the United States functions. We want to carry out democracy in a republic. So we often think of Democrats and Republicans. The core, the roots of those terms and the backgrounds of those parties, what they embrace or what they want to project, is the fact that we are a democratic country and we operate under a Republican form of government. What does that mean? It means that as a democracy, we want to promote broad representation. As a republic, we want to ensure that that broad participation then selects representation of particular constituencies. So we've got these two things that we want to accomplish. We want to ensure that there is rule by the people, as democracy would allow. But we do that by creating a republic, which means that we have representatives who express our wishes, which is probably very efficient and useful. A pure democracy would be cumbersome in a country of over 300 million people, to be sure. So back to Churchill's quote about the form of democracy as it relates to other forms of government. It's worth keeping that in mind. And this tension is a tension that is ever present, and it's one that's worth keeping in mind as we talk about voting systems here in South Carolina. Just briefly, if we look at the colonial period and the era of enslavement in South Carolina and most of the United States, it was, as I described earlier, it was a time during which the franchise was primarily restricted to landowning white males. So there was very limited political participation or contestation of any other group. Reconstruction, with the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867, brought with it the opportunity for broader participation, primarily by formerly enslaved African-American men and freed African-American men who had otherwise not been able to participate. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 required former Confederate states to adopt universal male suffrage as a condition of their readmission to the Union. And the result of this in South Carolina was essentially a flowering of democracy, a constitution that was created that provided for rights in abundance and was quite progressive for its time. And it was met with a backlash. It was met with a backlash by a group that called themselves Redeemers, led largely by General Wade Hampton. And the Redeemers instituted a constitution in 1895, which is essentially the South Carolina Constitution of today. And that constitution is notorious because it also ushered in the period of Jim Crow in South Carolina. It provided for party control of primary elections, and there were specifically racialized purposes behind this party control. So U.S. Senator Ben Tillman in 1913, who had been formerly a governor of South Carolina, specifically called for whites to be the only arbiter in our politics. And there was legislative action taken to restrict Black access to the polls from a period of roughly 1915 to 1938. Going beyond that, in 1943, the South Carolina legislature repealed 46 sections of the state code relating to primary elections. This effectively privatized party practices, and this was done so that they would not fall under the gaze of the Supreme Court, which was concerned with state action. Private action would not represent a constitutional problem, but state action could. So a private organization would be beyond the purview of the court's reach. And we see this later emerge in a case called Smith versus Allwright, which effectively argued under the Equal Protection Clause that states could not restrict access to the polls, and that was in 1944. As a result, there was a second purge in South Carolina in 1944 to quote, guarantee white supremacy in our primaries of our state insofar as legislation is concerned. And this was a quote from Governor Olin D. Johnston on the 14th of April in 1944. Now remember, the quote that I shared with you at the very beginning is from Winston Churchill in 1947. All of these things are going on around the same time. And that's also worth remembering. In 1948, the South African government institutes a formal system of apartheid, which carries with it vestiges and elements of Jim Crow, some of which were imported into the country by looking at the American experience. So all of these things do inform each other, both on a national level and sometimes on a global scale. Everything wasn't bad in South Carolina. And there was actually some reform in 1950 and 1951. While Strom Thurmond served as governor, there was a standard ballot created in which there was no longer one ballot for Democrats and one for Republicans. There would be a single ballot, so you wouldn't know who someone was voted for simply because they had a certain ballot in their hand. The poll tax in South Carolina was actually eliminated in 1951 as a result of a statewide referendum. The one key element of these restrictions on voting that was retained was the literacy test from the 1895 Constitution, and that remained in place until it was abolished by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that Voting Rights Act obviously ushers in the civil rights era. With it, improved ballot access, increased ballot access. People who had never voted in their lives before were suddenly able to vote because they didn't have to pass the literacy test. They didn't have to jump through any of the procedural hoops that would have restricted their access to the ballot or to serve as candidates, by the way. But I wanted to focus on restrictions and expansions of voting rights specifically as I'm sharing this with you. And then as we think about this in the modern era, that era of the Voting Rights Act, we have seen roughly over the last 20 years or so, and I started working as a lawyer monitoring elections after the 2000 election. So the 2004 election was the first election in which I worked at the polls as an election protection legal official. And what we've seen largely mirrors what I've seen during that time, during the past 17 years or so, which are poll rolls, registration rolls have been purged. There have been challenges to registration. Voting machines have been unreliable or faulty. The time required to vote can be a deterrent to voting, or there can be limited polling places. The voting dates and the ability to vote early certainly varies between different states, and in South Carolina that has been the case. And then absentee ballot provisions, whether there are no excuse absentee ballots permitted, or you have to present some form of excuse that would justify your casting of an absentee ballot. Another thing that we see across the 50 states is the use of provisional ballots. And these ballots are problematic from a practical perspective because they're not often counted. So as a lawyer working at a polling place, I would typically do whatever I could to get someone to cast an actual ballot as opposed to a provisional ballot, because there is a concern that ballot would not be counted. There are a number of other ways in which access to ballots have been affected. Specifically, we think of convicted felons. In South Carolina, if you are a convicted felon or a violator of election law, you can't vote until you've completed your sentence. That includes probation and parole. Or if you're pardoned, you can also regain the right to vote. So I say all of that to go back to the core tension, the tension between democracy and republic governance. When we preference Republican governance as a way of expressing democratic ideals, what it may do, and what it doesn't necessarily have to do, but what it may do is it may create some perverse incentives for individuals who are seeking the imprimatur of a constituency, especially if they know that they only need to get a narrow percentage of that constituency in order to gain election, in order to be representative of that group, and would certainly pay more attention to their constituency, those people who put them there, than others as a result of the organization of the election and the electoral process. So process matters. And I'm grateful that we get a chance to talk about this in the context of South Carolina, and specifically as it relates to ranked choice voting and what the opportunities are that lie ahead. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists.
Great. Thank you so much, John. That was an amazing history. I know there's a lot to pack in a short amount of time, and it makes me want to go to one of your classes so I can learn more. So thank you. John's going to stay on for our Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, feel free to add them to the chat. Next, I'm just going to run through Paula and Barbara's bios. We're so happy to have them joining us this evening. Barbara has been a League of Women Voters member for over 20 years and served in many capacities, including the Arizona League State President, Vice President, Board and Program Chairs. She has done so much around our election method studies. She's part of the League's Redistricting Task Force, National Popular Vote Task Force. She's the founder and chair of Fair Vote Arizona, a board member of Project Civil Discourse, and much, much more. She is joined by Paula, who joined the League to work on electoral reform. She has been working with the League for over 20 years around studies and policy around the national popular vote and the League's voter representation position. She serves on her local League board, and she is the VP and Legislative Director for Californians for Electoral Reform. So we are so honored to have them tonight. I'm going to let them take the ball and share their screen. And again, as you have questions, just please submit them to the chat.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Leslie. Well, my interest in what some call a wonky topic, electoral systems, began after that move 30 years ago from urban Los Angeles to a rural town in Northern California. That's when I discovered where I chose to live determined my level of representation. And my political party seemed just fine with 40% of voters wasting their vote, voters like me, in this very safe district, as long as they got their very safe district adjoining. And that's where I now live. So I joined the Nonpartisan League of Women Voters way back then to better understand how all this works. And especially today, with our intensely polarized political environment, it's clear that in addition to all we do in the League to defend the assault on voting rights and all our important voter service work, even if you can vote, voters need their votes to be meaningful. So in order to empower all voters, we need to recognize the fundamental connection that our new national position makes. And that's the connection between voter representation and how we elect our representatives.
Hang on, Paula. We're just making sure that we're active here. Having a problem advancing the slides. There we go. Thank you.
Okay. That connection between voter representation and how we elect our representatives. We're so accustomed to voting in our current system that many voters and League members may have never given any thought to how our electoral system impacts representation. and impacts the resulting public policy and people's lives. As John said, your team either won or lost. So local and state leagues, including your state, took on the wonky electoral methods studies over the last 20 years, and it's resulted in this national position that was adopted with 93% support. I think that may be a record. We really want to thank South Carolina leadership for being part of the steering committee that led up to that vote as well. Our national position calls for electoral systems that provide the broadest voter representation possible.
Paula, we're having problems here.
It's not advancing.
It's not advancing. Okay, there you go.
There it is.
Take a
Broadest
look.
voter representation possible. And because we believe in representative government, we support proportional representation for legislative policy-making bodies. And we also support systems that inhibit political manipulation, like gerrymandering. So to get us on the same page, basically there's only two types of elections, those that elect one winner and those that elect more than one in multi-member districts. That's also known as at-large voting. And ranked choice voting can be used for both. We're talking about ranked choice voting because it meets the criteria listed in our new position. It was also the most popular among league members who did studies. It can be used, as I said, in both single winner and multiple winner. And many leagues have been instrumental in getting ranked choice voting adopted across the country, using their own state positions, but now we have a national position as well. People may ask, what's wrong with the current system? Well, our current system came over with the British, and it's essentially all we know. As John said, its formal name is first past the post. It's a horse racing term. We call it the plurality system. It's a vote for one, and the person with the most votes wins. The horse that passes the post first wins. Our league position supports implementing alternatives to this plurality system because the drawbacks are so numerous. Fortunately, ranked choice voting improves these issues. So now I'll be focusing on single winner contests, which are the vast majority of races in the United States. Your Congress, state houses, governors, attorney general, county boards, sheriffs, district attorneys are all single winner contests. Ranked choice voting will provide a majority winner in one election with no runoffs. Barbara will cover the multi-winner. When electing one winner, such as mayor or governor or sheriff, someone that will represent an entire county or state, you want to have the winner have the broadest amount of support among the majority of winners so that they have a mandate. This picture shows, I want you to see the picture. Barbara.
Okay.
There it is. This picture shows a clear indication of why our current system is not fair when there's just one winner. If all 10 people plan to meet and 7 out of 10 people want to go to the pub, why are we going for coffee? Plurality voting gives us coffee when 70% would rather the pub. The 7 people divided their vote, and we end up with an unfair trip to the coffee shop. All the beer drinkers split their votes, and that's why the few coffee drinkers won. RCV avoids vote splitting and gives us that majority winner with a mandate in one election. Now, some more on the intuitiveness of the ranked choice voting ballot. If your Mexican restaurant is out of red enchiladas, your favorite, you probably won't go hungry. You'll have another choice. And when voters backup choices are elected, voters feel they've had a say and they feel good about participating, even if the winner was their third choice, someone they could live with. They're not losers and they have not gone hungry, so to speak. Maine was the first state to use ranked choice voting statewide. And this is their official ballot, which looks much like the one you just looked at, and it functions the same way. You may see more candidates in the future on ranked choice ballots because like-minded candidates don't have to worry about splitting the vote. In this sample election, let's go behind the scenes and see how the ballots are counted to get a majority winner in one election. We'll do this in slow motion. A 100 people are voting for one winner, one favorite fruit for dessert. All the voter needs to know is the order of their favorites. If they only have one favorite, they only rank one. In this example, the 100 voters have ranked all the fruits. Lower rankings don't hurt your first choice. If a candidate gets 50% of first choice votes, they win. Here, there's no outright winner. Apple has the most votes with 40 and wins with a 40% plurality, even though 60 voters preferred someone else. That's our system. That's the plurality system. Now, with a delayed runoff between Apple with 40 and oranges with 30, the voters will have to go back to the polls for a second election. I understand that's not very popular in South Carolina. And fewer voters may choose the winner as well. 2 rounds are going to cost the taxpayers more money, and the candidates are going to have to raise money twice. And that campaign will ultimately, most likely, be much more negative. Fortunately, a runoff is not necessary. This is how the instant runoff, which is what it's being called in South Carolina, happens. In slow motion, when there is no majority winner, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and voters who pick that candidate as number 1 will have their votes count for their next choice. This process continues until there's a majority winner. So in this case, strawberries had the fewest votes and is eliminated. If you voted for strawberries, your vote's not wasted. Looking at voters' second choices, oranges picked up 7 votes, apples picked up 1, and grapes 2. 18 went to oranges and 4 to apples. In the first round, the plurality winner was apples with the most votes. But as we look deeper at voters' preferences, we see that oranges was the most popular fruit preferred by these voters. It's won with a majority and now has a mandate. So as a summary of what we just saw from the last slide, all the voter needs to know is their preference. The ballots are counted. Is there a majority winner? If there is, it's over. If not, you eliminate the lowest candidate and retally until there is a majority winner. Now, I just wanted to note that Fair Vote, an organization that you're probably familiar with that endorses ranked choice voting, they've just come out with a very revealing data report about the benefits of ranked choice voting for both candidates and voters of color. And we'll put that link in the chat. Now, about straight balloting. Don't have that here in California, thank goodness, but I understand you have it and it's used by 60% of the voters in the last 2020 election. That is significant. We put down some drawbacks, significant drawbacks here, but one of the key ones that you mentioned for South Carolina is that when 60% of the voters are using that straight ballot, they are missing the ballot, the lower ballot items and are ignoring nonpartisan races, for example. So that is really a significant drawback. And if you had ranked choice voting instead of that, it would certainly be preferable. So it's another reason to consider ranked choice voting in your state. So here's some of the benefits again of ranked choice voting. And I wanted to particularly point out one, why are campaigns less negative? Ranked choice voting campaigns have shown that the candidates who win talk to all the voters and they stay positive because they're seeking second and third choice or fourth choice votes. Negative campaigning just doesn't work. And often like-minded candidates even campaign together. Why will voters have more choices? Well, more candidates and diverse candidates will run without fears of splitting the vote and being a spoiler. And more people running means more voters are going to participate. These same benefits are all there with proportional ranked choice voting, and Barbara will cover that now.
Hi, everybody. And I just wanted to say thank you for having us. And also with Leslie's introduction of me, I want to make sure people know I'm in Oregon now, not Arizona. It sounded like I was in Arizona. Anyway, a different voice here, but the same playbook. So we are going back for a moment to this slide you saw before with the categories of single and multiple winners. Each has different systems under it, but ranked choice voting fits easily in both categories. And Paula demonstrated that ranked choice voting works to elect an executive office. But what about multiple winners like city councils and county commissions and school boards? One winner or many, this is the good part, it's not necessarily more complicated for the voter. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, they've used a ranked choice voting ballot for over 70 years, including at large, for multiple winners. And that was way before computers. And the only difference is how results are obtained. And I'm going to get into that later. More important is to understand that electing multiple winners is not always the same. Here's the rub. It can be great or not. There can be failures, but the failures come when at-large elections are conducted with the wrong type of ballot, the wrong system, but the wrong ballot. And of course, I mean a typical one. Here's the good, the bad, and the ugly of at-large elections. We can have the very worst of all voting systems or the very best. And we're talking in terms of representation when we say that. All of these, block, semi-proportional, and proportional, are at large, but we can either have the worst or the best results. Block, sometimes called plurality block voting, in which the most votes wins, allows 51% of a certain group to win everything, and those in the 49% bracket that's been mentioned by others get zilch, nothing. So block is especially bad for minorities of all kinds, and it's whether it's BIPOC, gender, political party, rural, it doesn't matter. This is one of the reasons that minorities have fought for districts for so long, because holding at-large elections with our typical ballot where the most votes wins sounds good, but it's really unfair, dreadfully unfair. So we can have this bad block system, which we have had, or we can have the gold standard of elections, proportional representation, such as proportional ranked choice voting. I like this slide because the little graphic people show why the difference is vital. Both are at-large elections, picking 5 winners, but block shows all 5 seats won by just one group of people, Whereas on the other side, proportional representation elected people from different groups in proportion to their strength in the community. And we should think of it this way. 60% of the people should get approximately 60% of the seats, but not all the seats. And 40% of the people should get approximately 40% of the seats, but not nothing. Now, is this a new idea? Not exactly. This famous John Adams quotation points to the underlying principle of PR. The goal of proportional ranked choice voting is about equal representation. And, you know, in the early 1900s, my grandmother belonged to the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which I'm sure you've probably heard of because it became the League of Women Voters. And its leader and our founder, Carrie Chapman Catt, was a major promoter of proportional representation. Fair representation has always been important to the League. This ballot should look vaguely familiar, as it's fairly similar to the ones you saw that Paula showed you for ranked choice voting for a single winner. It's still as easy as 1, 2, 3, just with more advantages. So whether we're looking at Mexican restaurant ballots or the fruit we're having for dinner, or as here, you know, our favorite first ladies, it's the same concept. I started to mention earlier, but the key difference between proportional ranked choice voting and single ranked choice voting is the threshold needed to win a spot. We're all familiar with 50% plus 1 electing a majority. Surprising to us non-math majors like myself, the formula which gets us to that majority is the same formula that establishes a proportional win. It's the same formula, but a different threshold to accommodate more seats. For instance, in a 1-winner race, only one candidate can mathematically garner 50% plus 1. And it's the same in a 3-winner race, or 4 or 5. But in a 3-winner race, only 3 candidates can garner 26%. So that would be the threshold. A greater number of people are represented. And again, it's a better mirror of the electorate. I mentioned that there are other methods under the PR umbrella, and John mentioned 2 of them. I wasn't going to get into them, but he mentioned party list and mixed member, and all would be beneficial. But ranked choice voting has 2 particular advantages in the United States. It's based on candidates instead of parties, which appears more palatable to Americans, at least it has. And then the other advantage is that ranked choice voting has a history here, already being used in government elections. So it's kind of shovel ready, if you will. The bottom line is that proportional representation is majority rule with representation for the minority. And I think that that might sound a little bit like John's quotation, and it's very similar. And I know I'm kind of repeating myself, but I want to put this in again. Remember that it's basically 60% of the people getting 60% and not 100, and 40% getting some, but not 0. Now, while we're talking of the 40% and minorities, I want to mention a few recent examples where at-large proportional ranked choice voting has been adopted to accommodate and ease minority complaints regarding Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. A reminder that these are at-large remedies using ranked choice voting. And 3 of them include June 2019, East Point, Michigan. You may have seen a movie was made about that. And in 2020, Albany, California, they voted 74% in favor of proportional ranked choice voting for city council and school boards. And in my state, Oregon, June 2019, we passed the Voting Rights Act, which allows for ranked choice voting for school boards as a preemptive approach against lawsuits and stuff. So sometimes I include this slide for unusual areas that use seats or positions in an at-large system. But for you tonight, this is just some comic relief and a chance to smile and take a deep breath. And while you do take that breath, I'm going to ask, why do advocates talk about gerrymandering and proportional ranked choice voting in the same breath? Gerrymandering, as opposed to fair redistricting, hurts democracy. Most leaguers understand redistricting concepts still. The next few slides are a bit sophisticated and somewhat difficult, but they're still kind of fascinating, so stay with me. Earlier, we talked about at-large districts with 5 winners. We were able to accomplish proportional representation and fair elections. Now we're going to step back to typical situations and to look at drawing districts that contain just one winner, which is sometimes called single member district, which I think is a confusing name and really just means, you know, one winner in that area. We're returning for a moment to this single winner district issue because that is where most gerrymandering takes place. Gerrymandering for bad redistricting can be evil for fairness. You may be aware of the terms cracking and packing, or even stacking, in relationship to gerrymandering. These are malicious, manipulative ways to redistrict, and a reason why the League supports independent redistricting commissions. But not all gerrymandering is malicious. Most is, yes, but not all. So if it's not malicious, can there still be a big problem? Yes. Self-packing is a geographical type of gerrymandering, but it's developed by where people choose to live. Democrats tend to pack themselves in urban or suburban city areas. Republicans do not. So in this slide that you're seeing, you see 5 single districts in this city. And you'll notice that one of them in this city, compact city, has a lot of Democrats. However, the total voters of the whole city have Republicans at 47.6% and Democrats at 52%. But such self-packing, which is hard to say if you say it a lot, puts the urban center party at a disadvantage. In this race, the Republicans win 4 seats and the Democrats win 1 seat. Even though these districts look compact and equal, it does not mean they are fair. Now, before Republicans in the audience think, that sounds pretty good, and ooh, let's stick with that, it's possible for it to work the other way. Admittedly, this is less common and a less common term, but self-cracking can also result in unfair results. Republicans can divide themselves up in such a way away from the urban centers that they suffer the same unfair result. You can think of Republicans as living kind of on the outskirts of these 5 districts. And in this hypothetical city, if we are there, in this hypothetical city, again, with 5 districts, the population mix is turned upside down from the other slide. So now the Republicans represent more people, 52.4%, and the Democrats 47.6%. There's more Republicans than Democrats, but even so, due to where they chose to live, they have divided or cracked themselves up, and not as a laughing matter. Again, the result is not fairness. In both examples, third parties, independents, and sometimes, as in these two cases, surprisingly, even major voters are at a disadvantage. Neither computers nor special redistricting criteria, nor an independent redistricting commission can fix this while we are still using single winner districts. Single winner districts frequently disappoint, but often we don't stop to realize where the problem is, that the district itself is limiting. Proportional ranked choice voting can avoid self-packing and cracking. And when drawing a super district to elect more than one winner with ranked choice voting, it's almost impossible to seriously manipulate district lines. So this slide simply repeats benefits we noted earlier about proportional ranked choice voting and why it can be seen so instrumental in many positive changes, such as reducing wasted votes, combating gerrymandering, and representing more people. All benefits of single ranked choice voting, plus more. And I just want to leave you with a simple thought. Ranked choice voting, both forms, uses the power of the backup vote, and by doing so, represents more people. So how can this happen in South Carolina? I'm going to turn it back to Paula if she's ready, and you can unmute yourself, Paula.
Hello again. Yes, more people in South Carolina would be represented if the Fair Representation Act were passed by Congress. On the left, you see a map of South Carolina with 7 single winner congressional districts. 6 districts are red, as you know, and 1 is blue. 90% of congressional districts are safe for one or the other party. Millions of Americans are basically orphaned in a single member district. I was that orphan voter for 30 years in Northern California, which is how I got involved in electoral reform. This can't be fixed at the polls. I tried. The US Supreme Court ruled in 2019 that partisan gerrymandering was a political issue and not their purview.
Paula, can I interrupt you for just a moment? I think that there's an awful lot of noise on the line and maybe people need to make sure they're muted again. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. The US Supreme Court said that it was not their purview and it's Congress that must end gerrymandering. And the Fair Representation Act does just that. Voters elect representatives with proportional ranked choice voting in larger multi-winner districts, as Barbara described. On the right, you see District A, 4 seats, District B with 3 seats. That's how the Fair Representation Plan could work in South Carolina. It was projected back several years ago by FairVote, who drew up these models, that District A would elect 2 reds and 1 blue and 1 toss-up. District B, which is electing 3 people, would elect 2 reds and 1 Dem, 1 blue. As Barbara said, proportional representation is majority rule with representation for the minority. In this case, the political minority. More voters are represented, and a voter can influence 3 or 4 representatives, all because candidates need their vote, and voters get to rank them. Voters have much more power. You can look at the Fair Representation Plan at the FairVote website, fairvote.org. This is a good start, proportional representation for Congress. I wanted to mention too, that there are some other major current efforts for reform. And these are things that give electoral reform advocates like all of us a lot of hope. One is the currently debated For the People Act, which would require that any new equipment that's purchased be compatible with ranked ballots. And then there's the Ranked Choice Voting Act, HR 4464, and also the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which revises pre-clearance for states, and it also restores Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And then there's the Fair Representation Act I just mentioned. It's HR 3863, and it calls for multi-winner districts combined with ranked choice voting, set up in states by independent commissions. Here in South Carolina, you have open primaries. In California, we have the Real Jungle primary, and the top 2 vote getters go to the general election. I would not recommend that. We have had congressional districts and other districts wind up with 2 people from the same party. And in some cases, those 2 people don't represent that district at all because of the vote splitting. It's great that you already have military overseas ballots and that you use ranked choice voting for them. So I would build on that. You can also encourage student bodies and churches and organizations to use ranked choice voting. These are some of the software that allow you to do that, and it's all free. You could start, oh, by the way, there's at least 85 colleges and universities that already use ranked ballot in their student body elections. You could start a local league interest group to help educate your members. And the number 1 on the list, join the Ranked Choice Voting Coalition, betterballotsouthcarolina.org. There is a movement already in South Carolina, and if you want to get involved, this is the organization that is already working on it. And as a matter of fact, tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, they will be having their statewide organizational meeting. So if you're interested in that, do contact them at that website. The other thing you can do is support the Fair Representation Act. And we encourage you to join our electoral reform allies list that we have started, that we have from all over the country. And all you have to do is email one of us at those email addresses and we'll get you on the list. And then stay tuned for how you can help support the Fair Representation Act in your state. That's it.
Wonderful. Well, what a great presentation. Thank you both. I think we are very lucky to have 3 fantastic speakers with us this evening. I'm going to run through our quick call to action, and then we will open it up to Q&A. We are running right on time, so if you have any questions, please do submit them in the chat. So for our call to action, what we've done throughout all these events is provide updates on HR1, S1, which we spoke a little bit about this evening. This is a big focus of our first event. It is up for a vote in the Senate this week. Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has said he will filibuster it, which means it would need 60 votes to move forward and clear the procedural hurdle, which will most likely not happen, unfortunately. However, it's always good to call your senator and let them know how you feel about this so they hear their constituents, and we do encourage you all to do that. And if you're interested in the filibuster, we had an entire event where we talked about it, so you can go to the League of Charleston's Facebook page and find that one and listen back. So what we are asking tonight, each call to action for these events, we try to switch it up a little bit, vary it. We're going to start on the local level for this one. So we really encourage you all to reach out to your city council or your county council or town council representative. shoot them an email and ask what they think of ranked choice voting. There are a couple of resources you can send them, some of the websites that Paula and Barbara went through. We can also share one when we send out the follow-up email with more details on the call to action and also where you can find your representative in South Carolina. But we really encourage you to start having those conversations on a local level. It'd be amazing if we had a city council in the state take on ranked choice voting and kind of clear the way and show how it can work and how it's done. So we encourage you all to start there. All right, so now we are going to go back to our Q&A with our panelists. We have a couple of questions that we will ask. The first one is going back to Paula and Barbara's presentation. What are some of the common arguments against ranked choice voting? What do opponents say about it?
Okay, so do you want real drawbacks or do you want what opponents say? They're not always the same. That's why I said that. Well, let me start here. First is machinery. For a long time, not all the machinery, voting machinery around the country has been able to handle ranked choice voting. That is changing, luckily, so that's not so big of a problem anymore. Ballot design is something that is a real concern that needs to be looked at, how the ballot is designed. It can make all the difference in the world. And also, it will need a little more public education than our normal elections. But getting back to opponents and what they say, one of the biggest complaints is that they'll say it's too complicated for voters. I hope we've demonstrated tonight that it's actually quite easy, but nevertheless, that is one of the complaints, that it's too complicated for voters. But a lot of the new literature that's come out, as a matter of fact, there's a big, where was that? Politics and Governance, the volume this month has a whole section on ranked choice voting and peer review articles. And it really shows that people get it pretty well, and it's not a terrible problem. No system is perfect, we have to remember, and there is one thing that's kind of complicated about ranked choice voting that could mathematically happen in a very odd situation. Of the hundreds and hundreds of elections that have now happened around the country, it may have happened once, but the thing is, you don't know beforehand that that could happen, so it doesn't change how you vote. So those are kind of the things that opponents point out. I hope that helps and gives you enough on that side.
It is, yes, thank you. The next question we have is for John, going back to kind of voting. As we see so many more restrictive voting laws implemented across the country, what is the best path forward to expanding voting access in South Carolina?
Speaking of it from the perspective of a lawyer, I would say the best path forward is to ensure that there is some broader national legislation that protects and grants expanded access to voting along any of the number of different ways in which it's currently being contemplated. And I would advise that, because if not, what we will see over a number of years going forward is essentially whack-a-mole, where we will have to deal with electoral systemic arrangements in one state. Once those have been addressed, then they'll pop up in another state, and it will ultimately undermine our confidence in elections, both at the local, state, and national level. So the consequences here are pretty extreme when we think about what this means for the legitimacy and viability of democracy going forward. So I would strongly encourage not only advocacy at the local level, but advocacy for national change, because national change is going to be the most effective in addressing these issues over the long term.
A follow-up question to that, given that probably our best hopes of national change are in HR1 S1, what do you think it would take for legislation like that to pass in the future or now?
I think we're at a moment at which the time may be ripe, only because everything looks impossible until it's done, and what we may see here is that enough members of both parties will come together and think about what the consequences are of hyperpartisanship. What I've seen, say, over the last 20 to 40 years is a pendulum swinging back and forth, but there's no momentum there. It is only swinging back and forth. If we think of what has happened periodically at the national level, one party comes into power, they implement their policy agenda, they lose, the next party comes into power, they undo that policy agenda and implement their own, and then the next one comes in to do the very same thing. It doesn't provide for any real measurable progress in governance. And what I think is one of the core issues of modern America is that we haven't figured out how to govern at scale. We are not built for 300 and plus million people. When the country was founded, the population was about the size of South Carolina currently. So issues and tools like ranked choice voting give us an opportunity to actually engage in more sustainable, durable change. And the one last example I'll give you is, as we're thinking about what the investments are going to be in the federal government, with the current round of federal spending as well as what is to come, if those decisions are made by a quote durable majority, a collection of people across party lines to say these are the things that we want to happen, we don't have to worry about those being undone or undermined with the next change in parties. And that's something that I don't think we have a real appreciation for at the moment, because we've been so caught up in the horse race character of our elections.
Thank you. We had another question on ranked choice voting. Paula, could you talk a little bit about where ranked choice voting is used in the country? And we also had a kind of attached question to that around the New York mayoral race and the primaries that are going to be held there tomorrow. And any insights you guys have into that, or ways that we can understand those results, what those results will look like, when we'll know the results, how it worked, all of that.
Well, let me start with New York, just to say that there's 8 very viable candidates. And so that's really where the focus is. And it's going to be very interesting because no one is really a front runner. So these rankings that voters in New York City will have, they can rank 5. They'll be very significant. In the end, there will be a majority winner. Just noting, though, this is the primary. The reason they keep referring to it as electing the mayor of New York is because New York is such a blue city that whoever wins this primary is likely to be the mayor of New York. Over lots of voter education has been going on in New York City to make sure that voters understand it, but it's still quite a feat to make sure that voters do know how to rank their ballots and know that they have more than one choice. As far as where it's used, first of all, it's used all over the world in different countries. In Australia for over 100 years, over 100 years in Ireland. They've elected females in those countries where proportional representation is used as well. In the United States, over 10 million Americans already use ranked choice voting. They use it well now in New York City. but many cities in Minnesota and 23 cities in rural Utah. Then here in California, it's used since 2004 in San Francisco and Oakland and Berkeley and several cities in the Bay Area. And it has saved so much money, I might add, in San Francisco and in these cities that have used it. The taxpayers have saved a lot of money, and the candidates have saved a huge amount of money not having to run 2 campaigns. And the campaigns also have proven to be more civil. And Fairvote has also a study that they did on that, because in San Francisco, it's been used for so long that they were able to actually get the data to show that people do understand it. Turnout is good, and that candidates and the city have saved a lot of money.
That's great. Thank you. So I'm actually not seeing any more questions. And I know it is a nice Monday evening here. I'd love to close with any parting words or thoughts from each of you. Anything else you may have wanted to say or didn't, or inspiration for us as we move forward?
I have something that Barbara, I'd like to share because I didn't, and it's important. A lot of times the biggest opponents to this change across the country have been election clerks, and it isn't because they don't like the outcomes, it's that it's a change and a different system for them. And if you run into that in your state, there is a group called RCV, or Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. And it's previous election officials, and they are there to help election officials in other states to go forward with these reforms. So it's a wonderful resource. And if you find that your election people are a little hesitant, it's a great asset to share with them.
Great, thank you. Paula, John, anything from you guys?
I would just add that I want to encourage all of you in South Carolina, if you're interested in this very exciting topic, to please join our allies list, because we will be working toward the National League Supporting Fair Representation Act, and we would really enjoy having your support. So please email Barbara or myself and get on our list. Oh, I also wanted to say I couldn't put the link in the chat, but we'll give it to Leslie for some of those other things.
Wonderful, yes. And everyone who's registered, we will send out the links, and we can send Paula and Barbara's contact information. And we will also share information on the call to action on how to find your local representative. John, any final words of wisdom before we close our event?
Just to go back to something that I mentioned earlier, Leslie, which was that democracy means broad participation. And broad participation means that we truly take advantage of the talents of a broader swath of our population. It doesn't matter which party we're talking about. We get better decisions when we have more input. And when you have to engage with people to truly understand where they are on an issue or what they truly feel, that is, again, what gets us to a more durable, a more sustainable governing structure that reflects who we really are. And at this moment, when we're actually concerned about the survivability of democracy in the United States, I think it would be truly transformative if ranked choice voting and the ideas that compel it take root and drive us to a better and different version of ourselves.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you so much. This concludes our 5-part Good Governance series. In all, I think we had over 500 people tune into these events over the past couple of months. So thank you, We will send a follow-up email with information on the call to action and links to what we talked about, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you, South Carolina.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
John,
Have a good evening.
wonderful. Right.